There are some principles in life that if we ignore them, it's to our own peril. Gravity falls in this camp. You defy it at your own peril. Money, you should take in more than you spend or use. Food, the principle's just the opposite of money. Some of them are just kind of local, colloquial ideas. For instance, if you hate guns and Tony's ice cream, Gaston County's a bad place to live. Some are more profound, like it's been said, when you give gifts, possessions, see a decrease in value over time, but if you can give an experience, the remembrance of that will increase in value over time. So there's just life lessons. The book of Proverbs is full of these different principles. Some immediately we see the truth, the validity of. Others we have to come to experience it. For instance, Billy Sunday was a traveling evangelist. He was the precursor to Billy Graham, you might say. He had a guy show up and he said, if you can prove to me one word out of this Bible is true, I'll start to listen to what you have to say about Jesus. He said, amen. Proverbs 30, grabbed the man by the nose and twisted it. The wringing of the nose bringeth forth blood. So, there are some principles, you'd say, they're just true. They're things about life that are true. One of the issues with principles such as these is we often recognize them after we've gone down the road a little bit. It's really hindsight. That's what makes somebody who has more years on us than we do able to recognize some of these principles they hope to teach us, because they're most often recognized by hindsight. The challenge with that, recognizing them only by hindsight, is the principle Jesus connotes in this passage and then reinforces. If you don't operate it, if you don't operate by it, rather, the principle, the last shall be first, you're going to spend your life trying to get ahead in some way, only to feel like it's increasingly empty. So Jesus is giving us a paradoxical principle. The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. And he says life should be oriented around this concept, because it's the only way that life really becomes full. So we have an opportunity, I would say, to see from Peter's perspective, the disciples' perspective, how this should land in our lives. I think because, to be real frank, just an unfortunate chapter break in chapter 20, we've disconnected this passage that was intended to be together, which further causes the issue to be exacerbated. And so what I hope to put on display this morning is this principle, how it works, and how it should be embedded in our lives. So it's a very simple process. First, we have to ask, who are the last that become first? Who is that? Who qualifies as last? Then we'll see that it pays to be last. The trick is we have to put those two ideas together. That's where the issue falls. We get who's last oftentimes, and we get the concept it pays to be last if we look at it. But how those two things fit together is really the crux of it. And it lands us at our own question: am I last? So let's work through it. Who are the last that become first? Here's the way, as I reference, the passage breaks down. The reason for rereading the end of 19, as we did last week, is because it all flows together. If you follow the logic of it, verse 27, Peter asks a question. He asks a question. Jesus gives an answer in verses 28 and 29 to Peter's question. And then he says the answer is obvious or could be established upon a principle. In verse 30, the first shall be last and last shall be first. Then he gives a parable that demonstrates the concept of that principle to illustrate it. You might say it's kind of like a little sermonette. He gets a question, Jesus does, he answers the question, then he says, this is the principle by which I'm answering the question. That principle could be hard to understand or hard to communicate, so let me give you a parable by which to understand it. So that's the flow, you might say, of the passage. Let me give you the claim the passage is making. If you forget everything else, this is the claim. If you have chosen to make yourself last, God will make you first. A lot more to be said, but I wanted to make it as simple and as straightforward as possible. If you've chosen to make yourself last, God will make you first. Let's see if we can establish that claim. What I'm going to argue by the end is that you should be trying to make yourself last. So as we walk through this passage with this question in mind, we circle back to it in verse 27. Peter has just kind of these blurt out moments, but he's clearly speaking on behalf of the whole group at this point. Because he says, see, we have left everything and followed you. What then will we have? He's taking, is this idea of following you really worth it, in question form, straight to Jesus? Is following Christ really worth it? I think it's an incredibly practical question. There's the mom who says, you know what, I put my career on hold and I put my salary on hold also I could stay at home with the kids. I just feel like that's the right thing to do, and I've put all that on hold, and I just get to the spot where I think, is that really worth it? We're not able to take them on some of the vacations their friends are going on. We can't put them in the same travel ball league. There's just limited resources. I think, man, is this really in the end? Is this going to be worth it? Somebody says, I want to follow Christ. I live in a world I didn't grow up in. And my family has very different views and values. My grown kids don't see eye to eye with me. Is it really worth it? It could be as simple as what Peter's asking. Peter's essentially saying, we have given everything. We've been tithing and giving and offering. Is that really worth it? We're giving enough that it sure would make a dent in some other issues we have if we didn't do that. Is that really worth it? So I think the question is very straightforward. Is living this thing out in a sacrificial way where we're actually having to make cuts some places. We're actually having to do things in a more difficult manner. Is that going to be worth it? To which Jesus replies in overwhelming terms. He says in verse 28, truly I say to you. So again, truly would be contradictory to a lie. The lie would be, no, it's not worth it. He says, truly I say to you, in the new world when the Son of Man comes, sits on his glorious throne, You have fallen me, will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. And he says, and anyone who's given up houses, relationship with parents, relationship with their kids, they've given up land, we'll see it come back 100-fold. Let me get into the details of this just slightly. This idea in verse 29. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters, father, mother, children, or lands. I would suggest to you he's giving those items in ascending order to the difficulty they are to give up. Follow that logic on this just real quickly. You might give up a house. Because we moved to an apartment, we no longer own a home, but it freed us up to be able to do more with our finances. We've given up a house. But he says, what about the relationship with your brother or sister? He said, man, if me following Christ puts a rift between my siblings, I don't want that to be the case. And even brother or sister. At that point in time, if you had a sister who was single, often they're widowed, have a sister who is single, she is more of a primary responsibility than a brother who would be single. So the relationship with the sister, you've got to be maintaining even more than the brother. He's supposed to go fend for himself. Similarly with father and mother. Mother coming second. So he's clearly, if there's some distance between me and my siblings, that's tough. Me and my parents. Then he gets to children. And some of you, because of following Christ, see that your children want less and less to do with you. And then finally he gets to lands. And you say, well, I could give up land way quicker than I could give up children. I would argue, not if you're Jewish. Still, to this day, as in that day, the promised land was something worth dying for. The promised land was something worth sending your kids off in battle to defend. He really is saying, in ascending order, all the way up to, you lose it all, it is going to be worth it, and you will see it come back in an intrinsic reward and extrinsic reward. You will see it come flooding back in 100-fold. I want to show you a Jewish man who I think got that. Philippians chapter 3. Verse 5, really in the end of second half of verse 4. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, so as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. Listen to this. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish in order that I may gain Christ. So you have a Jewish man who's really thought this thing out. For Paul, it would have alienated him from brothers and sisters, from mom and dad. As a single man, he would say, it didn't alienate me from my children, but it certainly alienated him from the land. Just a side note. I would suggest to you, Paul would not have been a Messianic Jew. Because, do you follow what he's saying? He says, I was living for these Jewish practices, But now it's a very polite way of putting it. Now they're all rubbish. I don't know anybody who says rubbish that's not from England. So it's very polite. It's not very Southern. He says, I count it all garbage. That's the same. It's an equivalent. I count it all. All those things are garbage for the sake of knowing Christ. That's what I now live for. So, Paul has come to believe that the sacrifice is worth it. I would say he trusts Jesus at this point. That even the most valuable things in life, relationships, are met with 100-fold. So Jesus gives in Matthew this overwhelming yes. It is worth it. And he says, essentially, you know it's going to be worth it because of this principle. The first will be last in verse 30, and the last first. So he says, Peter, the real answer to your question is this principle is at work. The first or last, and the last will be first. That's how you know it will be worth it. Let me make a suggestion to you. If you've been around church for longer than maybe a year, I suspect you've heard the first will be last and the last will be first at some point in time, and we have a tendency to gloss over it and not look at how ridiculous that phrase is and why it would need explanation. Here's how ridiculous it is. I have never told one of my girls, you're going to win the soccer game by kicking the most goals in the other team's net. You make yourself last, baby, you're going to be first. I've never said that because I'm a red-blooded American. We want to win. So, because that makes no sense. So if you've never pondered, how can this make any sense at all? I don't think you get the principle. Here's what Jesus is presenting. He's presenting an oxymoron that needs explanation, so he provides this parable. The parable has a bookend. So if you notice, chapter 19, verse 30, but many who are first will be last. Then he tells this parable, and he gets down to verse 16 and repeats what he's just said. The last will be first, and the first last. So the point of the parable is to explain that concept. Why would I count on that? Why would I be willing to sacrifice everything in my life to follow Jesus based upon this principle? So this parable is laid out to explain the principle. It pays to be last. So let's walk through the parable just very briefly. I think the parable is pretty self-explanatory. The parable is not complicated. I would say the thrust of the parable is that you would feel it way more than just grasp it. So it pays to be last. There are a few parts to this parable I don't think you would readily know because we did not live in their culture. So let me give you just a handful of things that are helpful if you want to interpret the parable rightly. Day laborers is who get the folks that get hired. Day laborers are below slaves. Slaves had steady income they could count on. They were not treated well. Please don't hear that. But they had steady income. They knew there was going to be food. Day laborers in their society were below that. Usually, a day laborer is the person who's not reliable enough to even be a slave. It's the town drunk. That's your day laborer. So at harvest time, somebody needs to gather in an entire vineyard's worth of grapes all in a couple days, and so they would go into the marketplace and hire extra help, seasonal help, you might say. They work at the Halloween store when it pops up in October. That's a day laborer. If you've ever worked there, I'm sorry. Secondly, they get paid a denarius. A denarius was equivalent to a day's pay for, typically, the standard was Roman soldier. So if you want to be paid good, paid well for a day, you would get a denarius a day. You would never hire seasonal help by the town drunk at the same rate as the military. You wouldn't do it. So in this parable, he shows up in the marketplace, hiring the day laborers for an inflated rate to begin with. The second piece is you have this third hour of the day, ninth hour of the day. The day began at 6 a.m. and ended at 6 p.m. So first hour of the day, so in this parable, the guy shows up in the marketplace just before 6 a.m. And probably, and very wisely, that's when your best potential employees are going to be there. They've gotten up early, they're in the marketplace, they're looking for work, right? So he's wisest. He gets there and he negotiates a wage with them. So he negotiates this wage first hour of the day. To be real frank, if you've heard this parable, I don't think we hear it quite like the original hearers. So if you've heard it, somebody would have said they were able to negotiate a denarius a day. That's incredible. They were able to negotiate $1,000 a day to pick grapes. You would think, wow, that's pretty incredible. So they show up, denarius a day, and they are going to work all day. As you followed, verse 3, it says that at 9 a.m., third hour of the day, he went back out, marketplace, found more workers. Noon, verse 5, then again at 3 p.m., each time going out, gathering more workers. Finally, verse 6 says he goes to the marketplace at 5 p.m. At 5 p.m., he sees some guys hanging out in the marketplace. I have read dozens of accounts of this parable. And it's funny, some people are really generous to the 5 p.m. guys hanging out in the marketplace. Well, they were there just all day, just wishing they could find some work. Here's the deal. I'll just be real frank with you. I worked construction in college. I worked for the construction company. When they had a big project, they would hire day laborers. We hired some guys at times, they would need to wrap up a project and they would go back to the day labor force and hire some more. I can distinctly remember one gentleman. I had never seen this before in my life. I was 18, 19, not real world savvy. The guy pulls up in this older looking car, flings his door open. Here he is to save the job site. And I kid you not, as he's going to get out of the car, he kicks and several beer cans fall on the ground. And I thought, I think you're supposed to be arrested for that, right? I'm in my 18-year-old mind, I'm thinking, how did he even get here? Which was a legit question because the nails all went in different ways. And so that's your guy who gets hired at 5. Nobody's hung out in the marketplace. I know there's a lot of sweet, kind of sentimental reasons people put forward for a 5 p.m. hire. Probably what happened is they did not get up. If you would put it in a real world context, they did not get up early enough to be hired by anybody. They show up at 5 hoping they can land a job for the next day. This guy hires them for an hour. Technically, he hires them at 5 p.m., so by the time they get to the vineyard, they probably work less than an hour. But they're credited by the other workers as having worked an hour that day. Then the vineyard owner does something no good employer would ever do. If you were going to pay out and you knew you wanted to pay the guys who had worked 1 hour, but you wanted to keep workers coming back in the future, you wanted to pay the 1 hour guys equal to the guys who've been there all day, who do you pay first? You pay your all-day labor first. and you send them off. Finally, you work your way down the line, and the guys who've been there just an hour, you say, hey, come here. Here's the deal. I know you guys have fallen in hard times. I want to help you out. I'm going to pay you a full denarius just like everybody else, but keep it between us. You run the risk that they show up at the bar that night, richer than they've been in months, and they brag about it. You certainly don't pay that group first in front of everyone else, because that's salt in the wound. So here's what Jesus is telling the story from the vantage point of the all-day laborers, right? That's the dialogue we get. If you had been there all day, you negotiated the rate, you've worked through the hot part of the day, and you see these guys roll in at 5 o'clock because it's 5 o'clock somewhere all the time to them, you think, this isn't right. To which Jesus works us down to his concluding thoughts in verses 14, 15, and 16. In essence, he says, it's my money. I will do whatever I want with it. Why would you begrudge my generosity? I'm just being incredibly generous. And he says, because the last shall be first. So here's the principle of the parable. When it comes to God, he operates by a different standard than the rest of the world. He lavishly pours out generosity when it is entirely unearned. Do you see that? These guys in no way, shape, or form deserved a denarius a day. And God says this is how he operates. He lavishly, generously pours out on the entirely undeserving group in overwhelming amounts. He says that is a principle as true as gravity. So here's the question for us. Who does that parable apply to? This is where, I'll be real frank, if you read a lot of accounts of this parable, it gets real squirrely really fast. One of the top groups I hear it applied to is those who would profess faith in Christ just before they pass. It's called a deathbed confession. And that they get into heaven just like the rest of us, so the rest of you shouldn't be jealous. Do you see what that would make the application of this passage? That would make the application of this passage in heaven. That's interesting. In heaven, when you get there and somebody made a last-minute confession of faith and they show up also, don't get jealous. Lord willing, we left jealousy behind. So, that would be a nonsensical view of it. The parable is being applied to the group Jesus just defined. So let's put it all together real quickly. Peter says, we gave up everything. We've given up all of it. And he says, if you've given up everything to follow me, I'm going to bless you 100-fold. Do you see how that works with the parable? Peter becomes the 11th hour worker who has a generous blessing bestowed upon him. Do you follow that connection? In the explanation Jesus gave, Peter is the one who's given up everything. We've chose to give up everything and to follow you. And Jesus walks through. Here's this incredible blessing that's going to reap because the first will be last and the last will be first. And then he gives a parable, but he puts it from the odd perspective so that we will feel it, how ridiculous it is for Jesus or God to be so generous. Peter is the 11th hour worker, the one who says, we've given up everything. When he gets to heaven and is rewarded for it by this generous God, it will feel like it is very disproportionate to what he's earned. And it is. It's incredibly disproportionate. He didn't earn this, but God says, I'll be generous with whoever I want to. My hope is for some in the room, it would be an immense encouragement. I think it starts at a very basic level. Some of you, as I referenced, you've chosen to make decisions in your life, like a stay-at-home mom. And you start to question, is it worth it? Jesus is saying, because of this principle, you will show up in heaven one day and you'll have stay-at-home mom and a mound of treasure for it. And you'll go, whoa, that's nice, but I don't think I earned that. And he would say, exactly. You didn't, but I am generous. And I want to reward generously those who made sacrifices to follow my son. Yes, this is way out of proportion. And that's the point. So it leaves a question, though. Peter's initial question had a premise. They chose to give up everything to follow Jesus. Have you chosen to sacrifice to follow Christ? That's who the parable applies to. That's who the question centered around. Have you made that choice? So I want to be very clear. When he says, we gave up everything, I want to be as straightforward and honest as I can. What's the sacrifice that's expected of you? They did not literally give up everything. That was hyperbole, you might say. We know that because Peter retained his fishing boat. They did not give up their entire family because Peter was still helping his sick mother-in-law. And according to 1 Corinthians, his wife traveled with him. So what does it mean to sacrifice for Christ? The initial thing they gave up was time and money. When they each get called, you hear this over and over and over again in Matthew. They immediately put down their nets. They immediately stopped mending their nets with their father. He immediately left the tax booth and went to follow Jesus. Immediately. They dropped everything else and prioritized Christ. Time changed. They were willing to sacrifice where they spent their time elsewhere. Additionally, money changed, but let me describe it to you the most accurate way I know. It's in the sense of opportunity cost. If you leave your fishing boat and you go follow Christ, they still kept the boat, but they stopped trying to maximize profit. They stopped trying to say, I want to get as many possessions as possible. I'm willing to sacrifice that. I'm going to retain the boat, and we're going to do what we need. But beyond that, I now am following Christ. We would talk about that as opportunity cost in financial terms. They did give up relationships. The way we know that they gave up relationships is because they were systematically killed. All the apostles, historically, starting in the book of Acts, are described as being killed. The only one we cannot validate that with historically is the apostle John, who was described as being boiled to death in one account, and he was put on the Isle of Patmos, as Revelation describes, for his faith. So when it came to following Christ, there was sacrifice. Here's the difference, I think, between many Christians I talk to and what I just described. Many Christians I will talk to say they're willing to sacrifice. That's usually the terminology I hear. We're willing to do it. Man, if it came down to it, we would absolutely sacrifice. We think we're just not in a position where we need to. Do you see what the disciples were doing? They were choosing to dedicate life to following Christ. They're choosing to make sacrifice. Let me give it to you in the most real-world terms I've heard recently. While our group was in Vermont, we listened to the president of the college there, Mark Ballard. He said, if you do ministry in that area, you cannot expect a paycheck from the ministry. He says, it's too small, funds are spread too thin, you don't expect a paycheck. So you start to have a second job while you do ministry. And he says they have to talk to students about this as they go through college. And he said one of the things they do is they tell the students, you'll be surprised at all the things you do not actually need. I thought, man, that's a good line. Until we met a graduate of theirs, Larry in Massachusetts. Pastor, grandfather, young grandfather, but he's got 2 grandkids. 7 years ago, gave up his salary so he could pastor, living off of what they had saved, and his wife works at the school. He is genuinely saying, you know what? We wanted to live our lives to serve Jesus, and we figured out everywhere we could cut. And I thought, what does that mean, everywhere you can cut? They cut oil to heat with in the winter because they figured out you can generally get enough firewood to do it. In 2024, there's a couple that says, you know what? I bet we can survive a Massachusetts winter on firewood. Somebody actually saying, we're going to deliberately sacrifice for the sake of serving the kingdom. You know the beauty of this parable? The sacrifice he and his wife are making, once he gets to heaven, will look like, in comparison to what he receives, working the last hour of the day. Compared to the generous reward from his Father in heaven, it's like, man, we worked in the cool of the day. It wasn't even a full hour, but don't tell them that. That's the parable at play. Would you, believer, choose to live your life by that principle? I'm going to intentionally, by world standards, make myself last in order to serve Christ because I believe he always operates by the standard, you become first. Do you trust that principle enough? I hope for some, and I know many around the room, you've said, we have made those types of sacrifices. Maybe not to the full degree that we can, but we have. I hope this principle settles into your heart. that it gets met with incredible generosity. To the point that you'll be like those 11th hour workers, a little embarrassed by how much you're getting for how little you did. I hope for others you would say, I could probably live by that principle more. If it's so true, if it's that true, what would it look to live by that principle more? Would you please stand as we sing this final song together?